All right. It's funny, I nearly wore that shirt. That would have been awkward. Name and lights, eh? Technology. Well, over the last 10 years, we at the Day of Hope and Leadership have endeavored to inspire you to perform acts of kindness and compassion in your communities. You know, those daily random acts that are really the things that pay it forward. They're the threads that form the fabric of life. Now, I want to tell you about some people who are really, really important in my life. But just referencing what Kate said, you know, she reminded us how we can all make a difference in people's lives and how the ripple effects of our actions, no matter how small, can impact the shores of our communities, communities where we ought to expect kindness. So I'm going to tell you about some people who went beyond what was expected, people who went the extra mile. Now, the extra mile, that's a common English idiom, not very common in occurrence, at least not in the literal sense. You know, when you go the extra mile, you go beyond what's expected of you. When someone asks you to go 1 mile, the good book tells us to go 2. Some people might ask for an inch and take a mile, but what happens when somebody asks for a mile because they need it, because they really need it? I want to tell you about Jeffrey and Rosalie, who really needed it. Jeffrey and Rosalie grew up in rural Zimbabwe in the 60s, and they were destined to change a nation, destined to touch the lives of all of us in this room, and how a few extra miles made all the difference. Jeffrey and Rosalie grew up, they didn't know each other. They lived in different parts of the country, and a lot of African children would have had a very similar upbringing. They lived in a rural area, so rural means probably the image you have in your head: huts, thatched huts, mud, thick grass on top for the roof. Usually in a pocket, you know, there's a kitchen, a bedroom, storehouse, just that kind of image. And as school children, they would have had to get up in the morning, take the cows out, down to the river. Guys would have probably done that. Girls would have gone and fetched water from the river and brought it back up for the morning breakfast, cooking, etc. And then they have to make their way to school, which could be 5-10 kilometers away. Then they got to do well at school, do all they can there, and then come back home, bring the cows back in, do chores around the house, and then, once the important stuff was done, settle down and do their homework. And I can imagine them. You know, if you imagine it's obviously by candlelight. This is the 60s, and this is Zimbabwe. And there's a candle, and they would take their books and lean them towards the candle and read them. And in that environment, with that extra work, they would have to perform well. Because the only way out was education. You know, the social conditions of that time didn't, put it this way, didn't allow for opportunity for most black children, black families, black anybody. And so education was a way out, a potential way out. So they had to do really well. And Rosalie and Jeffrey did. They did very well. And they did so well that they actually went on and won a scholarship that was given to one boy and one girl. And this scholarship was to a youth leadership college in Zambia. Zambia is a neighboring country to Zimbabwe. Jeffrey got there first, got to the college first a few weeks before Rosalie, and really excited, just pumped to be there. And he goes, he learned of Rosalie's future roommate, and he went up to her and he said, "Oh, I don't know who this girl is, but whoever she is, she's so special because she won the other scholarship, and I'm going to marry her." He'd never seen her before. He'd never met her before, knew nothing of her, just that she had won the other scholarship. Now, of course, as roommates go, when Rosalie arrived, the roommate said, "Hey, there's a weird guy on campus. He thinks he's going to marry you. Do you know him?" "No, I don't know." And it was so it was an interesting time. They actually started dating, and a few months later, in fact, Rosalie tells of how they went on this date, and this is advice to the young people, maybe older people who are still dating. But she went out on this date saying, "Well, here's this guy. He thinks he's going to marry me." She dressed down. She went to this date as badly dressed as she could. No makeup, no nothing. This is also the 60s, of course, so maybe there's something there. But nothing. And nothing to impress, of course. So, and she, and as a test, right? Because either the guy is going to walk away going, whatever, in which you just saved yourself a whole bunch of heartache, or he's going to respond and go and see past all the surface and still want to be interested in you once he looks past. So that was the kind of woman she was, secure in herself that she didn't need this guy, but just in case he is the guy, here's a test. So Jeffrey passed and they dated. Now later on that year, Jeffrey won another scholarship, this time to Lakehead University here in Thunder Bay, Ontario. This was game-changing, of course. I mean, first off, he's the first one of his family to go to high school, and now he has this life-changing opportunity to go to Thunder Bay, to go to university at all. And he was really excited. Now, before I carry on with that story, round about the same time Jeffrey arrived in Zambia for this college, a friend of his, Mr. Dennis Foote, also was transferred to Zimbabwe. Mr. Foote was an older gentleman. They had met in high school, and Mr. Foote took an interest in Jeffrey. Mr. Foote was transferred to Zambia, coincidentally, unrelated to Jeffrey's college. And that was just interesting because of what I'm going to tell you. Now, back in Zimbabwe, Mr. Foote had invited Jeffrey once, just to illustrate the climate. It wasn't usual for a black young male and a white male to necessarily have a friendship beyond an economic kind of relationship. Mr. Foote invited Jeffrey over to a garden party that he was having, just as a guest, and he invited all his other friends too. And the other guests went to Mr. Foote and said, "Well, why is the gardener mingling with us?" And that was just the time. It was a different age. Mr. Foote was a different gentleman, and we'll get back to him. So Jeffrey won this scholarship to Lakehead, and he's got the application forms, and he's filling them all out. And there's a section that says home address, right? Now he's in Zambia, he's from Zimbabwe, he fills in, well, when I'm done this course, and I'm nearly done, I'm going to be back in Zimbabwe living with my brother. So he fills out the home address section, and he fills it in as his brother's address. So he sends off the forms, and he's happily, sort of eagerly waiting for a response. And in that time, towards the end of 1967, a war broke out in Zimbabwe. A civil war that would have made it very difficult for Jeffrey, if he did go back, to remain and not get caught up in the whole civil war. So Jeffrey elected to stay in Zambia and help out at the college. And in that time, there was a couple from the US who were traveling on a world tour, traveling through Zambia, and chose to stay at the college for a while. And just the a couple of weeks, and they were teaching there. Their names were Maynard and Jean Beale. The Beals, I will call them from this point on. And they got to know Jeffrey. They were impressed by him. Jeffrey babysat for them here and there. It was just a good meeting. And, he's probably interested because he knows, hey, I'm going off to Canada, and here's some people from that area. Good to keep in touch. So Jeffrey's eagerly waiting a response from Lakehead. And the first response he got was a telegram. This is later in the year of 1968 now. Got a telegram saying, if you're not here in 4 days, we're canceling your scholarship. See, what had happened was, because he had put his home address as Zimbabwe, Lakehead was sending all the correspondence back to Zimbabwe. So letters and all the acceptances and all the documentation, everything he needed was going back to Zimbabwe. But he wasn't there because there was a war. And he didn't know about it until his brother telegrammed him and said, hey, you got to be there in 4 days. 4 days. If I told you today to be somewhere around the globe in 4 days and you weren't a person of means, you'd have a problem. This is 1968. Jeffrey was crushed, devastated. What do you do? This isn't just, oh, I might miss a flight. This is my life. The one chance. I won the lottery and I've lost the lottery ticket. Jeffrey didn't know that many people outside the college. The one person he did know was Mr. Foote. And he went over to Mr. Foote's place, and apparently it was 2 hours away. 2 hours away by bus. Jeffrey had to borrow money to get on that bus. And he went over to Mr. Foote, and you can imagine tearfully explaining his plight, his situation, explaining how the correspondence got lost, and all the anxiety. And he's only going there for advice. I mean, what do you do? There's no solution. There's nothing in your head that's, oh, hey, if you just do this, this can happen. He's just going there to say, you're the only person I know to turn to. Here's what's happened, and my life is over. He asked for advice, but Mr. Foote not just went a mile, but went an extra mile. Mr. Foote, sorry, I just realized the pun there. Mr. Foote went an extra mile, pardon the pun. And he went the extra mile. The closest Canadian embassy, High Commission technically, but embassy, the closest Canadian embassy was 1,800 kilometers away in Tanzania. Tanzania, well, 1,800 kilometers is about the distance from here to Florida. That's one way. Mr. Foote wasn't going to drive that, given the time constraints. So he chartered a private plane. It wasn't his son. He chartered a private plane. And he flew over to Tanzania. The only thing he had was that initial scholarship offer. And somehow he returned with a letter from the High Commission, from the embassy, saying, here's the situation, here's the plight, this is what we know. And he gave that letter to Jeffrey, gave him a plane ticket and a few extra dollars, and said, see you later. And Jeffrey took off to Canada. You can imagine that first flight. It would have been quite something. Remember, he hasn't said goodbye to anybody. It's just, boom. One day you thought your life was over, the next day you're on a plane. And he takes off, and they're off to Canada. And he lands, there's a whole bunch of stories in the middle of that, but he lands in Thunder Bay, a different country, a different culture, and this is the end of November 1968, a different climate. Did somebody drink out of this? It's open, so, excuse me. So, very emotional. He's in Canada now. Let's fast forward about 2 years. So he's doing well in Canada. He's studying, and he's also kept in touch with Rosalie, faithfully in touch. She's back in Zimbabwe. She's working as a youth worker in the YWCA, and she's doing her thing there, but he's over in Canada. And he's wondering, how am I going to get my girlfriend over to Canada? Again, 1971 we're at now. Pretty impossible, right? So, he wakes up one morning and he's divine prompting to call the Beals. And he calls them up. Out of the blue. There's no relationship. He babysat a little bit for them, 3 years back in Zambia, 3 years ago in Zambia. Now here he is, here's a situation. I would love to get my girlfriend over here. Would you sponsor her travel, her stay, and her education here? End of question. Big ask. Today. Crazy ask. 1971. People you don't even know. But when you need something, when you're in desperate need of something, you ask. Now, the Beals, unbeknownst to Jeffrey, and the timing was insanely impeccable, they were just about to sponsor somebody else. And here this phone call comes, and he asks, and they said, listen, we're going to sponsor somebody else, but we're intrigued by this. Have her send us some information. So Jeffrey quickly got in touch with Rosalie. Hey, you got to send a letter, get some pictures, do whatever you need to do to tell the greatest story, and they might sponsor you. She did that. She sent a letter, 2-page letter, and some pictures, and they were so impressed. I don't know what was in the letter, but they were so impressed. Man, if that's what it took to get into college, woo, and they were so impressed by her, and they agreed to sponsor her completely. Amazing. So she comes over, and they put her up. She went to school in Indiana, and she would spend her summers down with the Beals and holidays, and she became a part of the family. They took her in. And Jeffrey now, he's in Thunder Bay. He would drive down occasionally down to Indiana. It's a bit closer than Zimbabwe, so, kind of made sense. After a couple of years of that, they decided to get married. And the Beals, the whole family drove Rosalie up across the border, and they had her bridal gown, her wedding dress, hid underneath the seat because, of course, you can't come over and get married, and border guards would say a whole bunch. So they hid it underneath the seat, and Maynard Beal gave Rosalie away to Jeffrey. Beautiful ceremony. Rosalie and Jeffrey, neither of them had any blood relatives there at the wedding. Just the people who had helped. The people who had helped sponsor him, the Beals, of course, who had sponsored Rosalie. Now, without their intervention, without Mr. Foot's intervention, Jeffrey probably would have had to go back to Zimbabwe, way back in Zambia, right? Like, he would have had to go back and probably been one of the 30,000 young men and women who were killed in that war, quite easily. And without the Beals' intervention, Rosalie probably would have been caught up in that war too. But now here they were in Canada, newly married, and they began a young family. They started school. In fact, Jeffrey was well on his way in going into his second degree. Rosalie ended up doing early childhood education at Ryerson here in Toronto and raising a family at the same time. Jeffrey worked his way through 4 degrees up to his PhD. And then he began teaching at the University of Waterloo. And he became a professor later on at University of Toronto. In fact, he was so good as a professor that they offered him tenure. He was in his 30s. Tenure, that's, for those who don't know, it's like a job for life. And he turned it down because Zimbabwe had just become independent and they wanted to go back and help build a nation. So they packed up their young family and they went back to Zimbabwe and they hit the ground running. Rosalie, with her early childhood education degree, helped spearhead the very, very first preschool system in Zimbabwe. In fact, she wrote the curriculum for kindergarten that's still in place today. I'm sure it's been modified and stuff, but the base is what she started. In fact, Zimbabwe is one of the most literate countries in Africa, based in no part, I'm sure, to Rosalie's work. Jeffrey, actually, when they first arrived, in the first few months, he was offered a position as the first ambassador from Zimbabwe to Canada. So this meant going back to Canada. And if you know politics, you don't turn things down. You know, you see things on TV, you know, West Wing or whatever, and it's, I serve at the pleasure of the president, all that kind of stuff. You don't turn stuff down, and he did. Turn down tenure, turn down ambassador. He turns it down. And simply because they'd been away for 15 years. Both their fathers had died while they were away. They came back to brothers and sisters who were 15 years older than they last saw them. There's so much catching up to do. So they chose to stay and rebuild a nation. Jeffrey spent the next 34 years or so as a CEO and leader in a variety of fields, everything from mining to education, mass media, and as recently doing industrial development. And now he was appointed by the president as a commissioner of peace and reconciliation, working to facilitate peace throughout Zimbabwe and the Southern African region. Jeffrey never saw Mr. Foote again. The Beals were intimately involved with Jeffrey and Rosalie. They got that call in 1971, and Jeffrey asked for a mile, and they walked with him and his family for 46 years. I say 46 years because Jean Beal died last month. Jean Beal was 87 years old, and her husband, Maynard, who had passed a few years before, helped Jeffrey and Rosalie. And Jeffrey and Rosalie are my parents. My sister and I call them grandparents. You get Christmas gifts and in the same box with the same handwriting. It would be like a box that says, hey, from love, Grandma, Grandpa. Another one that would say, love Santa. Another one says, love Jesus. And you're like, but it's the same handwriting. And it was kind of crazy. Ain't no tissue up here, of course. My bad. Yeah, just a lovely life change. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Life-changing. I remember when we first went back to Zimbabwe, our life was very different. You know, here we were living in Toronto, and all of a sudden we're back in Zimbabwe. We're living at actually his brother's house just for a couple of months while they got situated. And this house, like maybe the stage, the square foot space of the stage would have been their house. And so for us, growing up in Canada, McDonald's, Saturday morning cartoons, all of that, now all of a sudden in this place, it was really difficult. Our first Christmas was there, and I remember just receiving 2 big boxes from them. 2 big boxes filled with gifts. Those are the kind of people they were. I have a little surprise for you. Paul, I don't know, I know registration was sold out, but I had to sneak somebody in today. I had to sneak Jeffrey in. And he's been listening on this phone. 2017, 19. We're 2017, so I thought I'd take advantage of some technology. And I thought maybe it would be good for you guys to hear a little bit from Jeffrey. My dad. I've never said Jeffrey so many times, and it's the oddest thing. Are you there? Hello?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, they can hear you, I think, yeah?
Yes. I'm good. Hello there.
Okay, and of course somebody calls. Really? I don't even know what to do here. Send to voicemail. Okay, you're still there, right? Please.
Yes, I'm still here.
No one calls all day except...
You can hear me.
Okay, sorry.
I've got a few take-home leadership nuggets. I can say my son there is an embodiment of the leadership experiences we have gone through. Yes, leadership is a way of life. My late wife and I indeed lived leadership. I can say to you that when it is a way of life, you do not decide to lead or not to lead. You live it because it is part of you. Leadership is a reflection of who you are, your being, your personhood, and indeed, your authentic self. Leadership brings out the best in others by sharing the best within yourselves. Leadership is making success happen for others. Just like Batsirai was telling you, some people made success happen for us, and that was proof of leadership. Your own success is an embodiment of the successes of others, because success can be reciprocal. Leadership is knowing that you have the power and the resources to develop, to serve, and empower other people without expecting anything back. Leadership is influence through self-communication. For you who are listening, he who can communicate effectively can indeed lead. In summary, I can say leadership is like mountain climbing without a tour guide. You have to depend on yourself, on your courage to complete the task. Hear me and hear me well. Leadership is intentional. Legacy is intentional. For you, to leave a leadership legacy wherever you are. Because that's the only thing talk about after you have gone 6 feet. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you. Stay in touch. Hold on. Sorry, I hope you could hear. A little bit impromptu. I woke up this morning and I thought, why am I just talking about him? It's 2017. I just call him. He could do the whole speech. I just have to stand there. I tried that. Thank you very much. Thanks to Nick at the sound who just made everything happen there. Now, Maynard Beale was a reverend, a priest in some traditions. And the Latin word for priest is pontifex. And pontifex means bridge builder, bridge maker. And I tell you this story today because Mr. Foote and the Beales were bridge makers. They made a way where there was no way. I tell you this story today at the Day of Hope and Leadership to charge you gathered here to be bridge builders. To be a bridge builder is to take people from where they are to where they're supposed to be. It's to iron out a path from where they are to where they need to be. You don't have to be rich to do that. You don't have to be well-resourced. You don't have to be branded and titled a leader. If you're an employee, you can help your coworkers. Take them from where they are today to where they need to be. If you're a team leader, a department head, you can take people from where they are. In fact, that's your role. From where they are to where they need to be. If you're a pastor, your job is to take your flock from where they are to where they need to be. If you're a mayor, a civic leader, political leader, your job is to take your people, your city, your town, kicking and screaming sometimes. Take them from where they are to where they need to be. And sometimes going the extra mile is not just building the bridge, but walking over it with them. And so I charge you today to be bridge builders. Not because it's fancy or something cool. It's literally the only way the world moves forward. You can think of everybody you look up to in life, all the people that are world-renowned. I don't care what field. I was thinking about it this morning. It doesn't matter whether you're Mother Teresa, whether you are Neil Armstrong, whether you are Jeffrey Chada or Mrs. Beale, whether you are Martin Luther King. It doesn't matter. The fact is, the reason why we venerate you is because you took us from where we were to where we needed to be. And sometimes, like Dr. King, you might not get there with them, but you pointed the way. Sometimes just stepping out on the moon takes us from where we were literally seconds before. We've never set foot on a planet or anything outside of Earth, and all of a sudden, here we are. A different species simply because someone had the courage to show us that there's more and built a bridge into the future that we take it for granted that we'll go to the moon. Yeah, of course. You know, people want to go to Mars now. We shrug our shoulders. Yeah. Things that were impossible over 100 years ago. Bridge builders. And all of us in this room have the potential to be bridge builders. In fact, the world needs us to be bridge builders. And if you are, if you take up that challenge, and I hope I need you to, you might have the chance to change a family, to change a nation, and to leave a legacy that will echo throughout all generations. And perhaps even in a generation from now, in a room of leaders gathered just like this, your story might be told of how you made a way where there seemed to be no way. So go therefore, out of Out of this 10 years of the Day of Hope and Leadership, out of today, go and find a Jeffrey, find a Rosalie, find somebody who needs you to go the extra mile. Thank you.